First, I would like to see, I'm sure you've heard the term big data even before you saw it on the poster tonight, right? So when you hear the term big data, what kind of things do you think about?
Facebook.
Facebook is a good one, so social media stuff, that's a big one. What else? What else is big data?
The NSA.
The NSA, we're going to talk about that for sure. What else?
Amazon.
Amazon would be another good one.
Identity theft.
What? Identity theft?
Yeah.
Use of big data, I guess, right? Okay, so those are all examples of big data. We're going to talk about some more. I want to start with this quote, which I like. Each of us now leaves a trail of digital exhaust, an infinite stream of phone records, text, browser histories, GPS data, and other information that will live on forever. So one thing about big data is that it's all made up of little tiny pieces of data about us, right? And so in that big data is things about you. And in the aggregate, it can show some very fascinating things. But when people can do fishing expeditions through it to identify individuals very specifically, that's something to be concerned about. So sometimes the focus on the definition of big data really is on the size of it. That it's a data set that's so large, so complex that your traditional database or data processing applications are just inadequate. That you're going to have, one thing I think is big data is often so big that it is never going to move. You never copy it from one place to another. You can't go transform it. No one's going to go through and pick out and delete one record for you, unless they're forced to. So it's hard to move, hard to transform, hard to edit. It can also be hard to visualize and understand and share and many things. And it is often kept forever. Because disk space is so cheap, once organizations have gone to the trouble of collecting this data, they think it's valuable, and they think, well, we might find something in it, years later. Why should we ever get rid of it? We'll just keep it there, rotating on storage forever. But it can also, the term big data can also refer to not sort of just the size of the data, but kind of the predictive analytics or other advanced methods of kind of correlating one pot of data with another to extract value out of that data. I do have some, they're kind of hard to read, but I'll read them off to you. Some examples of when we talk about the size of big data, how big we're talking about. So it's estimated that per day, the NSA processes 29 petabytes of data. So that's 1,000 terabytes or 1,000 gigabytes. Facebook, 600 terabytes, Twitter, 100 terabytes. So that's one metric of the size of data we're talking about. I have some other interesting stats that, especially relative to the NSA one. There is an NSA data center in Utah, Bluffdale, Utah, and it is a 1.5 million square feet, 1,000 square feet of data center space, so 1,000 square feet of racks of computers and racks of disks, and another 900,000 square feet of technical support and administrative space. It's projected to cost $2 billion. It will cost another $2 billion to fill it with hardware, software, and maintenance. The completed facility is expected to require 65 megawatts of electricity, costing about $40 million per year, and use 1.7 million gallons of water per day to cool the equipment. So that's some pretty serious data processing happening. So besides some of those really big places, who else has data about you? Where else is big data? Well, Walmart, yeah, grocery stores, your cell phone companies, movie rental companies, internet search companies, social media companies of all kinds, and really companies of every and any kind, right? They are collecting data about their customers, and at the moment they're kind of piling it up, and they're trying to find the signal through the noise. They're trying to figure out about that. And there's a booming business in data science. We have a few data scientists here, where companies are actively wanting people who are experts at helping them figure out the correlations in their data, find some interesting tidbit that can tell them how to run their business better out of that data. And so it's very interesting to consider in all of those pots of data, right? Who owns the data? who should own it? What rights do you have, if any, to inspect it, to correct it if it's just plain wrong? Can it be freely correlated with other pots of data? And we'll look at some examples of that. Can you know who has seen it and for what purposes? Can you request that it be deleted, the data about you, if you don't like it? In Europe, they have a right to be forgotten, so that you can ask the data about you to be deleted. We don't have that here. Should we? What are the implications of that? Those are some of the things that we're going to be thinking about and talking about. I also want to mention the idea that we are all pretty enthusiastically and voluntarily making ourselves very trackable. You know, if you think back to maybe a grocery store at the turn of the century or some, the last century, 1900s or whatever, like, there would be no price tags on everything, maybe even. There would be no records of who bought what. The transactions would be in cash. There would just be no digital trail of everything. Much more these days, almost so many of our minute interactions with each other happen digitally, right? Whether it's social media exchanges or texts or cell phone exchanges or so many things. And that is enabled through our voluntary use and carrying of things like cameras and microphones and RFID and cell phones and credit cards and emails and frequent buyer cards at the store, and all of these kind of things make so much of it means that we are emitting gigabytes of data every day, right? If you think about it that way. And also, we often very voluntarily reveal information that just takes advantage of our desire to connect with others, right? We want to share, we want to connect, we want to band together. And those interactions are often being mediated by companies and organizations that are designing those in a way that they control that data, not the individuals who are contributing it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that also. So in many ways, we have kind of a perfect storm of things. We have very cheap disk space, so once you collect it, you can store it forever, no problems. We have fast and readily available network access everywhere, so that data that's collected here can easily be transferred to these big farms, and hold it. We have these new types of tracking devices. We have willingness of people to carry and use them. We have this strong desire for us to connect and share with each other. And we have somewhat of a disinterest in privacy. Something, like, I don't have anything to hide. What does it matter if they collect it all? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. So there are many fabulous and motivating examples of things that big data can tell you. There's a website, you can check it out, The Human Face of Big Data, which interestingly is funded by companies that are enabling other uses of big data which you might not like as well. So the point of this is, these are examples where big data can save the world. Now we love it, right? And that doesn't make these examples any less inspiring, right? So we have things about searching for a cure for malaria. You see, tracking it across the globe, or combating counterfeit drugs, or understanding the way in which we exercise, working on crime patterns. All of those could teach us really fascinating things about the world we live in and the way we can optimize the world, get rid of problems. So that, those are interesting. And also, I think there are fabulous personal uses of big data that you really don't see much of these days, because the money and the effort behind this powerful technology is primarily being used to benefit companies and governments and things like that. There isn't a lot of interest in using technology is rarely evil or good. It's usually powerful, and if it's powerful, it can be powerful for both. But right now, there's not much of a funding stream that says, hey, let's help people really get the most out of their data, right? But some examples of that is, have you ever used some aspects of big data to help you examine the facts of your own life? Like, oh, that is how I spend my money. I would not have thought that, but now that I look at it in black and white, yep, there it is. Or that's how I spend my time. Or, what year was it that I went to that place again? And you consult the record, and it teaches you about yourself. It teaches you about your life. That's cool, I think. Also, I love the idea of me being able to collect data about myself, maybe that I use to optimize my health or whatever. I love that. And then maybe I could contribute it to science if I felt so. Like I think, okay, I've been collecting my, my heart rate and my, my sugar levels and my weight and my whatever for all these years, and I can correlate it with other things. And now I'm willing to contribute this to a project that I believe is worthwhile. And there's a lot of interesting like self-optimizing, people optimizing their own health in various ways. That's a fun personal big data trend. But then they say I can anonymize it in a way that I feel comfortable with and I can contribute it. That would make me happy. Or I love the idea of leaving the facts of your life to your children. Again, potentially sanitized if you feel the need or not. I'm a big fan of honesty, I'll say, but you might want to scrub some pieces of it. But those are, I control my data, I use it for myself, and I contribute it in a way I feel comfortable with. What's more happening these days is that there are pockets of data about you that are incredibly revealing. And I'm just going to list a few, and you can think about it. Have you ever looked back at your credit card purchases and seen like, okay, look, there you can see on Saturday I went to the post office, I went to the bank, I went to the grocery store. It says a lot about me. And if you can tie that to the exact receipts of every single thing I purchased in each of those places, right, okay, that's a lot of information. And then what if you add to that my cell phone records? So every person I ever dialed or they dialed me, how long I spoke to them, every text that's gone from me to me, all my emails, all the photos I took, potentially location data of the towers I bounced off of, all of that stuff, tons of information. Think about this one, I think your web browsing history, like there's not as much that really totally reflects what's going on in your mind as your web browsing history. Like would you really like, would you like us all to know all the things you've searched for in the last 2 weeks? Or does that make you go, oh, ouch, I don't know that I want that. So if it makes you go, oh, ouch, maybe I don't want that, Google has that if you're logged in, to your Gmail account or whatever when you are using Google. And in fact, you can go back and look at it, and they aggregate it into things. And I'll show you some specific ways you can look at that later. And I'm going to show you some examples of where search history was anonymized, released, and then de-anonymized. And so, so that happened to people. Those are all my search queries. I didn't know it was going to be released and everyone could look at it, but now there they are in public. Do you love that? Maybe not. And then, of course, there's social media profiles like Facebook and LinkedIn. We map out our friends and family. Right? And there's also sites where you contribute your DNA so you can see who you're related to. I mean, tons of information. You think about what all that says. And you don't own any of that data. You don't own it. And you don't control it. And that's the facts. So we're going to consider a few case studies about some of this stuff. We're going to start with talking about wearable devices, which Russ has a Google Glass thing on right now. There's other things. Anybody in here use things like Fitbits or anything like that? Okay, so we have people with those on. All right, okay. So it helps us in many ways to optimize our bodies, to connect with other people. There's fabulous things about it. You can tell things like your activity patterns, your sleep patterns. Some of them, say like when you wake up every time at night. They say your heart rate. They say how many steps you've taken, how many flights you've gone up. Some have location information. And one thing that I think is fascinating is most of them, in order for you to even view the data, you must contribute it to the company in the cloud. Is that true, right? Is anybody able to view the data on your own app privately without contributing it? Do you think that would be hard for some developer to make an app that runs on your own computer and nobody else's and just lets you look at that data and then contribute it only if you want? That would be very easy. Why do you not have that? You don't have it because they want that data, and they want the only way for you to see it is for you to give it to them. So that's one easy example of something you can lobby for. If enough people ask for that loudly enough, you don't think there'd be a company that would be founded that would give you that option, right? Because if people wanted it, they would go that way, right? So here's an example of the promise of big data. Have you ever heard of somebody who got paid to be like a sleep study subject? They would go in the lab and they would sleep and people would watch them. It's a great way to make money when you're a college student. Now these companies have more data about sleep patterns that has ever existed in the history of people ever Like you want to know, like, does the full moon make you stay up? Like, is it more in the cities, or the, is it the crickets in the woods that make you not sleep? Like, you can answer so many fascinating questions. That's inspiring, right? But by the same token, you think about the kind of things you could get from this information. Like maybe you have two people in the exact same place with high heart rate. And are you okay with that being something you just revealed to that company? You think of interesting correlations that you can get out of that data when you go on a fishing expedition through it. Okay, so that's one example. Let's do another one. Has anybody ever taken an online course in one of these MOOCs, the massively open online courses? Okay, fair number. So that's fabulous, right? The mission of that is like, let's educate masses of people, right? It's like justice in education in some ways. I personally know people who've like left tenured positions at huge universities because they're like, when I teach, here I touch maybe 400 students a year. But I could teach one of these and I'm reaching hundreds of thousands of students. I just feel like that's a better use of my presence in the world, okay? So fabulous stuff. Interestingly, in the process of participating in a MOOC like that, you are contributing data that you don't normally in a classroom. So they will see every single time you tried an exercise or how many times you took a test till you passed it. They'll know if there was a reading assignment, whether you read the whole thing and lingered on each page long enough that they could actually believe you read it, or whether you just looked quick at the first page and the last page. Now there's ebook readers that can tell the same thing, what pages you've actually read and which ones you haven't. There's even other platforms on local campuses that can tell that same kind of thing. Now you think about, one, how that changes the contract between teacher and student. Now I'm sure we have all gone to a class where we skimmed the beginning of the chapter and quick looked through it, and then I think I can fake it. Would you like the teacher to know exactly how long you lingered on each page? Or, right, at least, don't you think you have the right to know the way in which you're being surveilled, right? That feels only fair, right? You should know what the contract is and isn't. If people can observe you in a way that you don't know you're being observed, that doesn't feel fair. So here is an example of the promise of these MOOCs. These MOOCs have so many students that they can do apples-to-apples testing on the way you teach topics like it's never been possible before. Like, is it better to teach topic A before B or B before A? Is this exercise that I assigned, is it statistically significant to the outcome of the test, yes or no? Like, you can do all of these when we all like to learn better, and so that seems really motivating, right? But now, here's an interesting thing. Now the MOOC may have very detailed information that suggests really how good are you at this subject. Not did you ultimately succeed in it, but did you have to try really hard? Did you mess it up a bunch of times? They know how thorough you are. Were you a good, steady student? Or all sorts of interesting things, right? Universities for a long time have a history of making money because they're selling educational records of some kind or another. Even if that's only access to their students or career services or making relationships with, there's so many ways, or just paying for your transcript, $25 for this thing you're putting out, whatever. It would not be hard for the people who run MOOCs to say, we're just trying to make the world a better place, but we have bills to pay and we're not charging the students, so how bad would it really be if we sold some aggregated education records, or maybe even specific education records on students, right? They took these MOOCs, maybe they'd like to prove they did it, we'll sell it in these ways. But do the students who are doing that realize the way in which they're being surveilled, or the way in which that information, and here's another very interesting one, and I'm not, see if I can, this one made my head flip a little bit, but in these, you can get large demographic information about who is successful at what kind of tasks, right? What if it happens to be the case that one gender is statistically better at one thing than another, or one race than another? In this country, you are not allowed to make hiring decisions on those bases. Why? Because we as a society believe that whether or not there's any statistical, thing going on here, just because maybe a group as a whole is better or worse, you don't get to make that judgment about me just because I happen to be part of that group. You have to, that's not okay. You're not allowed to consider that in hiring. But you have that kind of data, and you know what people will say. it's not bias in hiring, the computer did it. It's just a machine learning algorithm that spit out what combination of things happens to best predict whether someone's going to be good at this task or not. Why can't I use that completely unbiased information in hiring? So I think that there's a lot of implication to some of these things that even if you start out with the very best intentions, leads us to some places we may not be expecting to go. Now, I think it's important to come to the NSA data collection example. So the NSA in this country, collects email and phone records and internet traffic, and we saw to the tune of 29 petabytes per day. And the scale of that was revealed, through confidential documents that were released by Edward Snowden. I'm not sure the degree to which you followed that whole situation. So what is the promise of that? Why is that being done? Well, I guess the promise is to keep citizens safe from terrorism, or find examples of things that are but there's big problems there. The history of government mass surveillance and the history of humankind is deeply disturbing. Right? This is not, and there is so much evidence that there is hardly any oversight. I could easily have come here and played you a documentary where you see like the head of the committee in Congress they're charged with overseeing the NSA, and they're like, we don't know. We can't ask those questions. We don't know how big that is or how much funding it is. We couldn't revoke that. We can't control that. That pattern, then who does, right? That is really deeply disturbing. And there's been active lying even to Congress, right? Oh, we'll do what we want. And evidence come out that we were lying. And are we as citizens gonna step up and make them come clean? No, it doesn't seem to be what's happening. And another thing to consider is the kind of potential for retroactive action. And what I mean by that is, maybe it's one thing to say, I become a person of interest and then the government is gonna watch me because I've done some things. It's a whole other thing to say, you can go on a fishing expedition through anyone's past at any point, the kind of innocent until investigated, right? Somewhere in that data, I bet I can find something that I can, that you did wrong, or I can blackmail with you with, or whatever. And that could be why Congress doesn't do a lot of oversight, just saying. If you have not watched the John Oliver segment on government surveillance and Edward Snowden, hilarious. 33 minutes of your life, very well spent. Look it up, watch it. You can thank me later if you have not seen it. This is not a funny quote. This was a quote from Edward Snowden. So one thing that John Oliver did is he went to Russia and interviewed Snowden. So that's a really fun, aspect of that segment. But he also does things like, try to get people's attention by talking about, well, what if someone had taken, a selfie of your privates to they call it the dick pic program. Then would you be upset? And then go and talk to people on the streets. And he tried all these other ways to get them, and they're like, no, I don't understand. And then suddenly like, no, that would be terrible. Let's stop that. It's kind of like a last Hail Mary attempt to get people's attention with the one thing that does usually get people's attention somehow or another. But here's not a funny quote. This is a serious quote. Snowden said this. What they will argue is that they don't use this for nefarious purposes against American citizens. In some way, that's true. But the real problem is that they're using these capabilities to make us vulnerable to them, and then saying, I have a gun pointed at your head, I'm not going to pull the trigger, trust me. And I think that that's a fairly accurate assessment of the current situation. Okay, to this point, I have primarily been talking about the type of big data where the people collecting it know exactly who you are. You have a Facebook account, you have a Gmail account, you have a credit card account, you have a grocery store thing, you have, the NSA knows who you are. So that's one set of problems. And we could talk more and more about the kind of things that are collected about you, how they are sold to other entities, how they are cross-correlated with different pools. And that's kind of the space we've been talking about. But I would like to shift gears a little bit and talk about another problem, which is when a pool of data is collected, it is not uncommon for the organization that collected it to say, I'm going to anonymize the data and I'm going to release it. I'm going to give it to researchers. I'm going to sell it to other organizations. I'm going to Just release it because I anonymized it, no problem, right? So we're going to talk about, does anonymization work? Is that something that's possible? Okay, so here's some data points from the history of anonymization. So in 2006, AOL released user search queries. So remember I tell you, would you like all of your Google searches to be posted so we can all see them? Okay, so this is kind of what we're talking about. So in AOL, they're much like in Google, there was they knew the username associated with all the queries. Okay, and what they did is they removed the username column. So they're like, okay, we've anonymized this data. So no, you can't tell who was searching for anything. We're just going to let researchers kind of look at it for other things. So the problem is that you often do things like search for yourself. Anybody ever searched for your own name? You search for things near you. You search for people you know. And researchers went into this data set and they guessed who a set of search queries belonged to, and they actually contacted those people. And those people said, yes, those are my search queries. So, okay, now you didn't have any idea that was about to be released. Now all of your search queries are out there. How do you feel about that? I would feel not so happy about that. Okay, here's another one. Do you ever rate movies in Netflix? If you rate movies in Netflix, they'll try to suggest ones to you that are, it's nice, right? They'll try to suggest other movies you might like based on the type. It's kind of, okay. So in 2007, Netflix released 10 million movie rankings by 500,000 customers as a part of a challenge. They're like, we have a recommendation system. Who can build a better one? And they also removed what they considered to be the personal details, where they're placed, the names or the random numbers. So like, you can't tell who rated what movie what. We're fine, right? Okay, so in this case, what researchers did is they went to IMDb, which is another source of movie ratings. And many times in IMDb, people publish public ratings. So you go there and you say, I'm Gina Matthews and I like this movie and this is why, okay? And what they saw is that if you take the public postings that someone did in IMDb, you say, I wonder if they rated all those movies the same way in Netflix. And you think about that collection of ratings as a fingerprint, and you find one that's exactly like that, they were able to basically match people's public ratings with their private ratings. But now, in Netflix, you also get the movies that you thought you were only rating privately. So maybe there's some movies I'm willing to admit in public I watched and I liked, or I watched and I didn't like. There may be other movies that I don't want to admit I even watched, let alone that I liked, right? Like I marked, please give me more of these, right? Like, oh, you know. And people they didn't sign up for that, right? They were just rating things in Netflix, and suddenly their ratings were de-anonymized. Would that be okay with you? You don't get a say in it because you don't control it at all. Okay, so here's another one. In 2002, there was a researcher named Sweeney, and what she did is she correlated public anonymous medical records from the Group Insurance Commission in Massachusetts. They weren't quite public, basically, but they were pretty widely spread around. They've been given to researchers, they've been sold to industry, they were highly available. And then she also correlated with the public voter registration records. And she successfully de-anonymized the medical records of William Weld, the governor of Massachusetts at that time. And the way she did it was, he was able to be uniquely identified by his birth date. This is data, but it should be birth date, gender, and zip code, 5-digit zip code. Now, your gender tends to be obvious, not always, but often. Your birth date, especially if you're the governor, is probably well known. And for many other people, your birth date could be found with a little digging. And the zip code you live in is also not particularly private, right? And those three items, it is estimated, uniquely identify 87% of the US population. So if an anonymized data set is released and it includes birth date, gender, and zip code, then for 87% of people in the US, you could uniquely identify their information, just like happened to the governor of Massachusetts. So again, how do you feel about that? You don't get a say in it, and that's part of the problem, right? Now, so you get this kind of, these are epic fails in anonymization. But there's another story to the anonymization thing. There's this interesting kind of back and forth and back and forth. So that same researcher, Sweeney, said, okay, what I did to the governor of Massachusetts, let me tell you how you can fix that. I proposed this system called K-anonymity. And what that means is that you ensure that any question you ask, you get to hide in a crowd of answers of at least as big as K, and you get to set K. So you say something like, I never want to be in a crowd less than 100 or 1,000, or whatever you want to say, 5, whatever you set. Okay? And she's like, that would have solved the problem. The problem is I was able to uniquely identify William Weld by those 3 things. And so we can scrub the data until that's not true anymore. So, okay, that was a step in the right direction. That fixed one problem. But then some other researchers came along and they poked holes in her K-anonymity. They said, I tell you what if you're hiding in a crowd of K, but every single element of that set K has the same setting for a sensitive column. So say I'm hiding in a crowd of K out of 100 people, but we all have AIDS. Well, then you know what? I have AIDS, right? And she didn't think about that. And there were other things that people poked holes in her K-anonymity. So they're like, okay, I tell you what you need to do is L diversity. Okay, so they had a way to do it. Then other people came and they poked holes in L diversity, and they said, okay, what you need is T closeness. And I'm not going to here go back and forth on all of the, the technical details of those things, but I can tell you that I remember this back and forth. I remember being like, oh, good for you, Sweeney. That was a good move down the road. You're right. I think that'll really help. Hiding in a crowd, that works. Oh, no. Oh, now I think you got a hint. No. And really, over time, I have come to understand that you have to degrade the data to the point that it is not useful until it's anonymous. So there's a balance between what you have to do to mess it up, and if you mess it up enough, then you get anonymity, but then it's useless. So when anybody says to you, I'm going to release data anonymously, you should just say to yourself, they're going to release my data. Right? Or it's not going to be useful. So remember the human face of big data and all those like crime and malaria and all these great things. What you have to understand is the price of useful data for big human problems is that your individual data can be the source of a fishing expedition for somebody. Yes?
Or you have to trust the researchers.
Or you can trust the researchers that are holding the data.
Yeah, but assuming they don't in turn sell it. Or give it away.
Well, that's
right,
part,
and there's
that's part of trust.
there's an interesting dynamic where once you have data, not only does the organization itself never get rid of it, but they give it and they give it and they give it and they give it, and then so you find a problem in it. You can't even get back to all the copies to fix it, right? And people know about that for credit reports. Like if you hear the stories of people who are trying to clean up their credit reports, and if you consider the fact that for credit reports we have legislation that says things like we can inspect it and we can get copies and all of these things, that we do not have rights like that in most of these spaces. So even in an area that is regulated, there are big problems.
And once it's released, even if with a good researcher, that's gone from your control.
Well, the NSA has a copy. I don't bother backing up my software. I just let the NSA take it.
Yeah. I've seen cartoons that are like, at least the NSA could just like tell me my password when I forget it. At least they could provide a public service or something. Okay. So I would say to you that one good takeaway from this would be whenever you feel anonymous, beware. Like you should basically say to yourself, like, did your mother ever tell you, you shouldn't say anything in private that you wouldn't say in public? Maybe that's not a bad idea. We can't all live like that. We all have to have some privacy, which we'll talk about a little later. But I'm just going to go over some other ones. Do you think you could make an anonymous blog post on something? No, and I'll tell you why. There are researchers who I've seen their work where they can basically identify many characteristics of writers. They can tell you that's a man or a woman. They can tell you what place they came from in the U.S. Are they originally a speaker of another language from anonymous text, and it doesn't have to be that much. And if they have samples of your text that are yours, they can tell you if you wrote that same blog post, because we all have little tics, little stylistic tics in the way we choose words or use words or put things together that they can find. So, okay, fine. So for any computer scientists in the room, same with the contribution of open source code. So if there's code that you've written and said, this is my code, and then you contribute something anonymously, they can, same idea, it's called code stylometry, you know? The same kind of little ticks in the way you use things can fingerprint you. And there's another, you guys know Bitcoin, like the person who did Bitcoin is not known who it is. If that person had posted another set of code that was under their name, this kind of technique could probably tell you who they are. Maybe we'll find out that way some way, I don't know. What about when you surf the web? Do you know, like you're in your house, you're like, nobody's watching me, you know, surf this, you know, like look up this kind of, you know, sensitive thing or this potentially embarrassing thing. I feel really anonymous because I'm home by myself, nobody's watching me or whatever. If you feel anonymous when you surf the web, you should not. You probably know things like cookies, and they can track you site to site, and they can see where you came from and those things. But I'll tell you, it's even worse than that. Because if you look at the technical details of the request, the HTTP request that's sent to the server, there's tons of details there, like what version of the browser you are using, what browser, what version of the browser, and then like all the plugins you have, their exact versions, what language you prefer, what IP address you're coming from, so many things, that even if they couldn't look at that and say it's Gina Matthews, they could say, I've seen you before. I know, just like I know that this went with you, that went with you. And then there's tons of stuff that tracks you from site to site. So if I'm using a site where I'm identified, and then in a chain I'm using other sites where I'm not identified, basically you should not assume you're anonymous. And there's even stuff like topic honeypots. A honeypot is basically where you try to, you know, learn who the bad guys are by drawing them to you. So say I put up a site that's about bomb building. And then I just watch who comes, and okay, and I have some more to say about that in a little bit. What about when you're carrying a passport or an enhanced license here in New York? Very, very similar kind of thing. Those things are readable at a distance. It's one thing, like if I know I'm giving my ID to someone, or I know I'm giving my credit card, I realize I was revealing information at that time. But if I'm just walking by and I have something with RFID that's not, you can also put in these sleeves and keep that from happening, but it's readable at a distance. And so they may not be able to, off that, the number that's on there, say, oh, it's Gina Matthews, but they can say, oh, I've seen you before. You've walked by my store before. And then if I ever go in and like pay for something with a credit card, then they could associate those things together. Now they do know it's me, right? So, and here I'll give you a little teaser. Do you think you're anonymous when you check out someone's public Facebook profile? Facebook says that they do not reveal that information. You can't tell who looked at whose Facebook pages. But if you ask me at the end, I think there's a good way to tell sometimes. Okay, so what can you do about this stuff? Well, I will start out by saying that I don't recommend living paranoid. And I'll give you one example of why. I read this book that was from this person who was all about how you cannot be trackable, and you can, you know, just, and what they did, they set up drop boxes, so they never shipped anything to their house, and, you know, like, you know, they had everything in a trust rather than in their own name, and they had all these elaborate schemes. And do you know what happened to them? One of their relatives got them a magazine subscription for the holidays and sent it to their home.
Ruined the whole thing.
So that's it. So you're never going to have anyone over to your house. Now your relatives can never know where you, like, basically, it's just, okay, so if you don't want to completely drop away, do you really want to live a paranoid life? I know very well how trackable I am, and I choose to live bravely rather than paranoid. I have a cell phone, I have a Facebook account, I have Twitter, okay. But at least I have the luxury of knowing, maybe more than most people, the way in which I'm surveilled. So I can make choices about, am I going to say this in this forum or not? Am I, I understand, and it's not perfect. I realize that maybe no individual piece of information that I'm revealing I feel okay about because I thought about those. But I realize that in the aggregate it says a lot about me, like what time I do things, where I do them from. That there was a story, a newspaper article about They gave a new cell phone to someone who worked at the newspaper who had children, and they had her use the cell phone. And basically she took pictures of her kid. I think she had a daughter, and she took pictures of the daughter in the bed, in her daughter's room, and at school, and at the daycare, or whatever. And there was like all the GPS tracking information embedded in every photo. So after that experience, basically you had a map of where and time of day that child was. And if you don't know that's being done, that's really the worst part of it, right? It's one thing if you realize what you're giving. It's another thing when you don't at all. And I think a lot of people have no idea the degree to which their things are going on the record forever. Okay, so what are some things you can do? You can ask why. You can challenge data collection requests. They say, I want your zip code. Why? Why do you need my zip code? Right? Or, I want your driver's license number. Why do you need my driver's license number? Push back a little bit. I think that's healthy. I think we should all be lobbying for laws that give individuals more right to inspect, correct, delete their data. You can look at a little bit what's happening in Europe, but I think it should go even farther than that. And a middle, like many of you maybe work in higher education. I don't know if you ever heard of like the FERPA laws. Students can say to a university, I want to see all the records you have about me. And as a teacher, I've gotten these requests. An email comes to me and says, a student of yours that you had 3 years ago in this class has issued a FERPA request. We need you to look through your records and see if you have any records on the student. If you do, we need copies. And that's a fairly labor-intensive, resource-intensive kind of request, right? I'm not saying that that's simple, right? But there's legislation like that in little tiny pockets of things, and I think we need to have more of it's a Wild West almost everywhere else. They collect data, they have it under one privacy policy, they change it at will, they don't even think about what the privacy policy is, they sell it, they release it anonymously, they cross-correlate it, whatever they can figure out, they do. It is completely the Wild West. And I think it would be good for us as citizens to say, no, we want to have some policies, we want to have some social norms, we want to have some accountability. I think using and supporting services that do offer stronger privacy and anonymity properties. There might be a search engine that's maybe not as fancy, but it has stronger guarantees. Or maybe there's a community that's a little bit like Facebook. Maybe it's not as big of a community, but maybe try to use it and try to get other people to use it. Try to think about services, vote with your feet, and use things and form communities that have these things. Another thing we talked about earlier is requesting interfaces that allow you to view your data without contributing it to the cloud when it comes off of a Fitbit or whatever. Say we really don't need to be giving this to you just because we want to look at it. Turn off tracking when you don't really want or need it. So try to understand, the things that are being tracked on your cell phones or whatever. Think about your privacy settings. Hold governments and companies accountable for their data collection and use. I think we really all collectively need to be doing a much better job of holding the NSA accountable in this country. I think it's a crying shame that there's not more rising up. I don't know if anybody go see Citizen 4. The one was in Cinema 10 last year. If you haven't, that would be great. It won the Academy Award for the best documentary, so it's well worth your time to watch. Watch the John Oliver video. Trust me, you will love it. I'd be happy to send you the link directly. Push for transparency and symmetry. I think one of the things that makes me the angriest about the NSA thing is they don't want anybody to know anything about them. They don't want them to know how much funding. They don't want them to know where the sites are. They don't want to know what they're doing. Everything is supposed to be super, super secret, but they want to know everything about us, right? I have this in a later slide, but I might as well just say it right here. I actually think I probably could live pretty happily in a world where we all knew everything about everybody. Because I would put my weirdness up against anybody else's any day. You can know mine, I'll know yours, we'll just all get over ourselves. If that truly was the way it was, I think I could live with that. But it won't ever be that way. The way it will be is we have this illusion of privacy, but then things are brought to light to control people and by governments and organizations. And that is not a world. I don't want to live in a world where powerful entities know everything and I don't know anything. Or we've all seen cases of people who are horribly moralistic in public, and then you find out they have an incredibly seedy underbelly of stuff. And it's like, really? Like, so that kind of dynamic where in public we think, oh, shame, 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 this is horrible. But then, like, that is the way human nature appears to be, unfortunately. And I don't think that, like I said, if it truly was, we all know everything about everybody, I think I actually could live in that world, but I don't think it will ever be that way, so I think we should just admit it, yeah.
There are sites around the internet, from what I've seen, that supposedly you can log in and then surf anonymously through them.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to me that was probably a great way for somebody to hack into it and get everything you knew.
So it's interesting, so when you come to anonymous web browsing, there's some interesting things like who do you want to be anonymous from? Most web routers have like incognito mode or things like that. Now that is typically hiding you from other people who share your computer. So that would be like if I share my computer with someone, I don't want this to go in my browsing history, or I don't want this to, and also sometimes it doesn't send cookies to the other side. So there's some things it's hiding from people near you, some things it's hiding from the server, right? But then there's other things like the Tor browser bundle. Tor may be what you're thinking about. If you don't know anything about Tor, that would be nothing to Google and learn about. That tries to even give you anonymity of association. So you can imagine saying, like, even if my connection was encrypted, just the fact that I made a connection to this particular site could be somewhat incriminating. And that like does a bunch of hops. And so if you want to know more about anonymous web browsing, there's a lot of fun things to learn in that category. I'd be happy to send people some links if they want. So other things you can do is, develop models for successful data sharing. Like one thing I think, and I don't have time to talk about it too much, but one of the worst things about it is the enabling of a phishing expedition through data. Like it's one thing if I controlled my data and you said, okay, I want to ask you a question. And I say, okay, I'm willing to let you ask that question and I will return that answer. That's fine with me. But I controlled that. You didn't get to go asking everything you want. You didn't get to like examine it all and like go on a fishing expedition, right? Because if you did that, I would see the rate at which you're doing that and I would stop that. So kind of breaking up who holds the data from who's asking questions, I think that has some potential, yeah.
Even if you had companies or organizations who were very good about not spreading the data around and all that, every time you pick up the paper, they're getting hacked. And that's,
I think that is another, in fact, we're going to get to that. I think that's another really crucial thing is if you collect data and hold data, are you stepping up to your responsibilities of keeping it secure? Regardless of what your policy is about it, if you don't secure it, then lots of places could have it. Hackers could have it. It could spread around in other ways. So that is an excellent point. I'm so glad you made it. I did want to talk a little bit about some privacy policy recommendations that USACM is the public policy arm of the largest professional science society in computing, the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM. And they have a committee that works on public policy recommendations, as touches technology. And I've been a part of this group for a while. And I joined after they put together these privacy policy recommendations, but I think that these are a great example of, like, if you don't really know what you want to ask for, these can give you some ideas of things you want to ask for from organizations, from governments, when it comes to data privacy. So, for example, I'm not going to read all of these, I'm just going to give you a flavor. Collect and use only the personal information that is strictly required for the purposes stated. Keep it only as long as needed. Delete it when you don't need it anymore. Minimize what you take. And that is not at all the ethic right now. The ethic right now is take everything you possibly can, keep it for as long as you possibly can. Consent, so really informed consent, and that's a big problem. Like, they pop up this huge legalese, and you're like, okay, whatever, I agree to anything, just let me in. So models for consent, and also, disk space is cheap, right? You could associate with every record the privacy policy information under which it was collected. Why don't they? Because they don't want to, right? Then as they change it, right, they could keep track of what it was collected when the rules were this. Right? Most of them have something like, if we ever change the rules, you agree. Right? Many of them are like that. Openness, explicitly stating the purpose, clear, okay, I'm not going to go through too many of those. This is, I think, a really important one. Establish and support an individual's right to inspect and make corrections to her or his stored personal information. allow individuals to determine which parties their information has been shared with. Again, disk space is cheap, right? Why couldn't you tag anytime you share data with someone a chain that says, I gave it to them, I got it from here, so that if you need to make corrections, you can follow that trail back. They could. Why don't they? They don't want to. Provide clear, accessible details about how to contact someone appropriate to obtain additional information on how to resolve problems. Propagate corrections in a timely manner. Here's the one you mentioned. If you have personal information, you need to secure it so that it doesn't just go walking out the back door to anyone whatsoever. And, you know, when you think about that, that's tough, you know, because all copies of it, right? If they stored it one place and they made a backup, or they, you know, shipped it somewhere, or you've all seen like things like, oh, there's all this data on an employee's hard drive and then that laptop got stolen or whatever. That's happened a bunch of times. You know, but those are some examples of, if you don't know what to ask for, what to agitate for, those are some concrete things you could point companies and organizations or anybody that's collecting data and saying, these are some rules I'd like you to abide by. Are you abiding by them? Why not? I mean, I think the more we all agitate, you know, that's better. The more you question, the more you get it on the radar that people are discontent, the more companies and governments will think about that and respond. Yeah.
Okay, but all of these steps that you think people should insist upon have a cost. For example, I run several public mailing lists. From time to time, somebody sends me an email and says, I want you to remove this particular posting from the mailing list archive. And I'm like, no. I do this for free. I'm not going to impose a cost on myself. You signed up for the mailing list. That's the only way you can send mail to the list is if you're on the list. So you voluntarily chose to give up this information. You don't get to change your mind in the future.
So, I mean, I think we have to have
So
a society. Yeah, okay. No,
let me go on. So what that's going to do, if there was a legal requirement for me to spend my time and effort going in and deleting their emails, that raises the cost for me to run free mailing lists. So I'm going to want to inevitably run fewer free mailing lists in the future. And that similar effect applies across the board.
So I think, you know, that is not an uncommon dynamic in many things. You know, we have laws. If you run a business, you know, and you have employees, you know, they can send you things that make you have to like garnish wages for child support or all kinds of, that's a big pain in the butt, right? There's lots of things that just because you are engaging in something, so the society was decided this is your civic duty. You have to do this. This is the law. And we haven't really, so unless we want this, unless this data Wild West is okay with us, we're like, oh, no problem, this is good, let's go on like this, then I think we have to have a discussion about what costs are going to be passed on to companies and organizations in order to carry out our collective wishes about what rights we want to have to our data. There's no free lunch. And another thing to think about is we probably will have to pay more for services. Like, there's a good rule of thumb that if you are not paying, then you are the product. So, you know, you have a free Facebook account, you're being sold, right? Anytime you have a free service, you are the product. Often, very often, that ends up to be the case. And so, right, so there's costs, and we're going to have to decide. But if you look at the current situation, I would be willing to pay some more for some of these horrible things not to be happening, right? I am not okay with the current status quo. So I think I'm okay with shifting some costs and bearing some costs in some different ways. And I hope other people are too, yeah.
Would you be willing to do it if somebody offered you $10 to do it?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Got a question here in the middle.
Yes. Privacy doesn't only apply to people who provide data, it also applies to people who acquire it. So the company's going to go out in the market and buy these big data sets. If they decide they don't want to be known, how can the law impose on the people selling the data to tell you we sold it to X, Y, and Z? If X and Y and Z are going to invoke their privacy rights and say, I'm buying it from you, I want you to tell her how you bought it.
You know, and in general, that's an issue with digital objects. is that you can make a copy of them and not lose the value you have in your own copy. And that is a thing. There's many wonderful things about digital objects, right? But that's one thing. So if I have a data set and I am say we have laws and you violate those laws by selling it, what would be the enforcement mechanism, right? I mean, many things we have laws, enforcement is difficult, right? I still think we could have laws that could change the way big companies manage things, or we could control our own government a little better. I think there still will be cases where if I have data, I break the law and I get some money from it, but you always have that kind of thing. That doesn't decrease the value of setting laws and societal norms that are going to control more of what is happening. I'd like to end with this slide, because I think one thing that often comes up in this context is kind of just a belief that privacy is maybe not that important, that, you know, I don't really have anything to hide, and that sounds like a lot of work to not be so trackable or to agitate. Why don't I just let them know everything? I really just don't think it's a problem. So I would like to end with some arguments about why I think that you should maybe rethink that, if that's kind of the answer that you say to yourself. So one, I think we all need space for dissent and discussion. So there's been a lot of things over time that have been illegal that you maybe now you think should be legal or are legal now, or, you know, you may say, I believe that law is bad and I want to organize with others, we want to discuss how to change it. Doesn't that sound like good citizens should be able to do that? So if you can't do that, you know, that's bad. If you don't have the right to say, or if you don't have any space to say, I don't agree with this law, I'm going to carry on my life in private the way I like, and, you know, is that okay with you, right? Is it really laying everything on that? Basically, you think every law that they pass, you're going to be fine with obeying, right? You know, okay, so that's one. I also think you need space to try and develop new ideas. So I want to be able to say, what about we do this way? And then you say to me, that's stupid, because this isn't, and I think, oh yeah, you're right. I don't want to go down the record as having thought that was a good idea. We don't get anywhere unless, if everything we do goes down on the record forever, and that was what you believe, you know, you once mentioned it, and it got caught on film, and that forevermore is that you truly think about something, that's not fair, right? We all need to have a space where we say stupid things, we reconsider, we change our minds, we talk it out. Okay. I really feel strongly that you need, if you believe something, I don't think you actually truly believe it unless you've heard the opposite of it argued in its most potent, eloquent form. Like, you should seek out people with opposite opinions and you should listen to them. And then if you still disagree after that, you should say, okay, I really adds to my belief, right? I know what I believe, I know why I believe it. And if by the act of listening to someone express an opposite opinion than yours potently and well done, you go down the record as believing that thing or being sympathetic to that thing, that is incredibly damaging, right? If you can't, there's no space for, I love this quote, the clash of ideas is the sound of freedom. We should, in a civil society, be listening to each other, even when we're almost positive we totally disagree.
We should watch Fox News, right?
Definitely.
I think, yeah, I do. I do think you should. And I also think that you have a right to keep private what others may use to prejudge you. You have a right to say, if you knew this about me, I think you would not listen to my ideas, or you would, you know, and I don't think you have the right to do that. So I'm going to withhold that information from you. I don't want to lay everything about my life out on the table for everyone. Okay, so if you think about that set of things, I don't know if that changes anybody's mind about thinking that we do need a space for privacy. And that's the kind of space that you need to defend before you really, really need it. Because if you wait to try to defend it until you really, really need it, then you find you don't have that space anymore. So I think it would be good for us to establish the line a little farther back. The very last thing I'll say is just a few little homework items. If you want to see your Google search history, you can go to history.google.com. You can see, is your history being recorded or is it not? It could be turned off, it might be turned on, and that's kind of fun. Another thing that's really fun is to look at google.com/trends. So I searched for a trend on big data. You can see who searches for it when, over time, in regions. You can see the most common Google searches right now. It's like the kind of zeitgeist of the country, of the world, of what people are thinking about and searching about. And so those are some other fun things that you could do as homework to think about some of the things. And you can think about it both from the perspective of, I'm not sure if I want everyone knowing my search history, and you can also think from the perspective of, ooh, look at all the cool things we learn when we put it all together. You can kind of go back and forth. I like it, I'm scared, I like it, I'm scared. Okay, questions?
Is there trends like on Bing and other search engines?
I wouldn't be surprised if there are. I mean, these companies all learn from each other. Like what one feature one has, most of the other ones do. I don't know the URLs off the top of my head for those, but I would be surprised if they didn't have similar things.
You didn't say anything about maps.
Google Maps and stuff like
Google
that,
or Bing
or the
Maps.
satellite images where you can. Yeah, there's
The week of the 4th of July, Bing came through and photographed everything in this area. And I'm on one of their pictures. I saw the truck or the car going by, had a tower like this with cameras, and I'm like, hi. We need to get the cameras.
Oh, that would be great if you could have gotten a sign, like it said something funny or whatever. That would have been hysterical.
If I knew it was in the area.
Yeah.
Well, and to further that, the advent of all these GIS systems aggravated with all this data and the GIS systems, they can tell so much from a mapping program of who lives in that neighborhood, who buys what at that neighborhood, and that's really creepy. Insurance maps, voting records of things.
Yeah, if you're an alum from a university and you live in a wealthy zip code, you might find that they're a lot nicer to you. Like there's like I think we're lucky here in that we have very large zip codes. That it covers a lot of things, so maybe we're not. But yeah.
Not when you add the 4 digits to the end.
Well, that's five. But even
There's like 5 people. If you take my 9-digit zip code, there's like 5 people who live there.
Yeah.
Is there any realistic possibility of coming up with data protection that's not going to be hackable? Because it just seems like every level from private people up to government, they get hacked one after another, including the military, who you would think would be pretty secure.
So I teach computer security at Clarkson, and one of the things I always tell my class is that I don't think it's possible for anything to be completely secure. Because as soon as you have any use whatsoever, you have people that could be corrupted or blackmailed or whatever. So that's one argument right there. But also from a technology perspective, anytime you're using something that you didn't build, there's a huge chain behind it. Like there's a fabulous funny lecture, Reflections on Trusting Trust, which is this thing about how these pioneers of computing systems built a hack into the fundamental underlying compiler that would insert a backdoor into everything it compiled, or so the rule.
Including the compiler.
Yeah,
and here's another.
So you can't see it.
So basically, what I tell people is the U.S. government is super paranoid about buying, disks and memory and CPUs from other countries. So basically, what I tell people is unless you are carving the silicon ingot yourself and etching all of the circuits, and unless you built the compiler out of assembly language yourself, then there are people that could have built stuff that it's impossible for you to examine or find. And that is another example. You buy new things and you think, well, they don't have any viruses on them, they're new. Do you think that? There's great examples of there was these USB attached picture frames you could buy at Walmart, and as soon as you attached them, they were loaded with malware, right? So basically, if you want to secure anything, it is a game of escalation. It is a process, and anytime you stop and stand still, they will get you, or they can get you. Because if you're not constantly watching all the evolution of, at this point, constantly the history of security, like you saw with that anonymity stuff, is, okay, I have this kind of safe. I can break into that kind of safe. I have a better safe. I can break into the better safe. I can have a better safe. I can break into the better safe. It's this constant game of escalation and it back and forth. So as soon as you stop, eventually you will become the weakest link. So there's some type of attacks where they're not after you in particular, they're after the weakest link. And if you stop, you'll become the weakest link. And even without that, if they are after you in particular, then they can escalate so much other means to get you, however. So, if you care about securing things, it is a constant process of balancing how paranoid and how much cost you're willing, because any security is a tax on you. Like how often do you think I lock people out of my car? How often do you think I lock my frickin' self out of my car? Right? You know, any security mechanism you put in place is a hindrance to normal use. And the only way you can get absolute security is up that so much that you never use it. You have any window of use, and it can be exploited. And so sometimes this is a very unpopular opinion. I remember somebody who was head of Homeland Security or something like that came out and said, I don't think it's possible to completely secure things. And they're like, that's your job. And they like tore them, to pieces. When that is the facts. And I think we do ourselves a disservice as a society to say things like, because something so horrible has happened, we must do something.
Yeah, seriously.
Does the TSA lines at the airports, do they work or not work? They don't work. There's plenty of things that show like you send 100 things through, they all get through, they don't work. So if experimentally and quantitatively this is not helping, then why are we inconveniencing all of ourselves? It is a heart-crushing reality that the things we love are very fragile. It takes many years to raise a child, and it takes no time to shoot them in the head. And it takes many resources to build a tall building, and it takes nothing to blow it up. And that is the reality. And we can fight against that by saying, we must do something, right? This must be illegal, and we must check this way. And unless it actually does any good, I'm a big believer in quantitative experiments. Like you try this, and then you measure to see if it helps. If it doesn't help, then stop. And I don't care how much you hated the fact that it did a bad thing. If what you're doing is not helping, then stop. Because you're getting in the way of other things by doing it. And that is a very unpopular opinion, by the way.
The land of the free and the home of the brave.
Yeah.
You're not going to be free unless you're brave.
But it is a hard thing. Because when something bad happens, we all want to say, we have to do something. Right?
It was on the news today that there's a congressional commission that's investigating the Secret Services. And the boss of that commission, they were hacking into his private records.
I'm shocked to hear that.
So, yeah, you can't protect it.
I'm going to voice an unpopular opinion then here, but from my point of view, I've often wished that I could access the database that might be available to health insurance companies.
Oh, good luck.
Because I think I could find easily correlations between allergies, particular types of allergies, and lifestyle choices. I have a whole host of them that I think I see, and if I could, actually quantify them, I think it would help us deal with these chronic health issues that we have.
number one then.
But this data is obviously completely off limits.
But see, that's
And
the
it sounds to
problem.
me like you would like to close everything off to that extent.
No, what
And
I would like...
don't see how that would help society as a whole.
But see,
Actually-
for every good, somebody's going to turn around and use it for a bad purpose.
But isn't that
Well,
what it is always?
I know.
You stand on the shoulders of upright people always.
Right?
What I would like to see is that this digital exhaust these gigabytes of information that I'm pumping out every day, I want them to belong to me. And then I want to say, I'm willing to contribute it to allergy research. In either completely unanonymized because I want to, or anonymized in some way, or something. I'm deciding that is worth it to me. And I'm willing to accept queries about my data for the public good. I'm willing to, like I said, donate them to my children in the end. They can go through whatever I want to do with it. I want the contract to be, it's mine, and I can give it to enable things like that. And you might actually have better luck with that, getting people to donate their own data than you would getting insurance companies to give it to you, actually, yeah.
I was just gonna say to that, maybe never say never. I just got an email maybe 2 months ago that, any New York State employee that had the Empire plan, all of our health records were hacked into. And now a week ago, I get another email that now all of our Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield records have been hacked into.
You just
They
gotta
never
know,
say that you can't access health records.
she just has to know what a hacker.
Be a hacker, right?
That's all we
Yeah, we gotta hire a hacker.
for a 36-year career, and it's all been hacked.
So it is a complicated, messy space. It very much is. And whenever you have something of value, it draws criminals. You know, where people hang out, where money hangs out, where anything of value hangs out, it brings criminals. So if you have data which has value, that'll bring criminals. You know, things are rarely good or evil, in my opinion. They're usually powerful, and they can be used for great good, and they can be used for not so great good, you know, or evil or whatever. It's more about, so I don't think there's any way tonight that we're going to solve many of these issues, but I think there's a couple things we can do. We can educate ourselves better about the way in which we're being surveilled, so we can make better choices, and we can help our friends and neighbors understand. So at least they're making reasonable choices. They're not acting away, thinking it's private when it's not. I think that's good. We can spread the word about ways to turn things off. We can agitate. I think we really owe it to our country to agitate a lot about what our own government is doing. And I think that we should also be agitating at companies, you know, and having laws. That it just shouldn't be the Wild West forever. I think in this space, this is kind of a new space, and it's kind of a crux right now, because the more companies get used to being to the Wild West, this is something, another thing I learned by working with that USACM folks, is that unlike legislation on people, where it's kind of like you will do this, legislation for industries and corporations is very much a negotiation. The government says, we would like to regulate you in this way, and companies say, no way, you couldn't possibly do that. We couldn't do that, there's no technical way. And then the government brings experts, and they say, yes, you could use this technology, you could use this and that. And the government, then they find one element of that industry, and they cuddle up to them, and they like get them to do it. And they're like, see, those guys did it. And then they go a little while more, and then they find one element they think that's really bad, and then they like penalize them. And they say, see what'll happen to you. And then they say, you must have it done by 2012. And then nobody does. They're like, okay, to 2014. So like, the more companies get used to the Wild West, the harder it's going to be to rein it in. So like right now they've got these big piles, and they're training and hiring data scientists, and they're like, you know, we are finding the value of this. You know, we are like in the Wild West. So now is kind of a time where we might be able to wrangle it in. The more they rely on it and get a taste for it, the more harder it's going to be to wrangle in. So all I can say is that we are trying to all come together tonight. We all came out on this rainy night, and we're willing to think about it a little bit. Maybe we can talk to each other about it. Maybe we can lobby a little. And we can all try to do our part to try to, because if you think about the future with the way the NSA is going, or the way, you know, these powerful forces knowing everything about us and us not knowing things, I don't really like that future. Yeah.
Well, what specifically should we lobby for?
Well,
if we wanted to make simple legislation.
So I think these privacy policy recommendations are good ones. You know, I could forward you some of those. Those are some specific things that you could ask the government and companies to abide by, and you know, I do a lot of thinking in this space of, like I said, models for data. You know, like it's too much to do all of this here tonight, but I tried to leave you with a few things that I think concretely that you could do.
Well, when you check into a hotel, they want to see your driver's license. And I'm like, I'm not going to drive your hotel anywhere.
Yeah,
I'm really not.
When you lobby for legislation, it has to be something straightforward.
You're right. It would be good for us to all get behind one thing to ask for, and I guess that's more of like, I guess I'm a scientist. I'm not maybe as good at the political reality of organizing people behind a simple common first request. I think that's a set of skills that's also very valuable, but that may not be my skills. So if you have those skills, maybe we could partner together. I can try to, we can try to decide what to ask for, and then you can go figure out how to ask for it or whatever. Yeah.
I also want to say from the other side of things that while there are a lot of these hacks and stuff, there are also people working to try and protect you. I know you do work in computer science. I also work in this field. I work in a specific field in biometrics where there are abilities to hack fingerprint sensors and stuff like that. And I'm one of the people that does it on the good guy side. My professor I work for owns a company that works on designing software to help prevent all this. So our job is to try and stay ahead of the criminals. We have to think like them, figure out how they're going to break into systems so we can create solutions. And as you were saying, it is an escalating war. It's basically going a back and forth. But it isn't all bad. There are people that are trying to work for you and actually trying to get the systems secured. And we are fighting this back and forth war trying to keep things secured. We can't always succeed, and it doesn't always work. It is back and forth, but we are trying. At least there's something there. We're doing the best we can to keep everything as secured as possible.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah,